Alright, welcome back to a task one. And here we will be talking about the second step of an A1, also known as the relationship paragraph. And something that we need to start off with is that the relationship paragraph is the paragraph that is most heavily weighted in this assignment. So whereas the other paragraphs have a weighting of 4 marks per source, the relationship paragraph has a weighting of 6. So this is a step that if any step is going to take a little bit longer time, it should be this step. So in terms of the relationship paragraph, something that many students forget to do is to provide a overarching theme, an umbrella question, something that connects all three sources together as a set. And if you don't do this, then the best you can hope for in terms of your assessment would be a limited mark, 40%. So I always teach my students that let's begin this relationship paragraph, your last paragraph of the assignment, with an overarching theme. So you might have a sentence such as this, that, taken as a set, comma, each of the three sources provides an answer to the same conversation of to what extent and whatever that common theme is. So the first step that we need to do in the relationship paragraph to hold them together as a set is identify an overarching theme. Some kind of umbrella question. In 10, it's probably going to be about to what extent is globalism or globalization, justifiable. In 20, it's going to be something about nationalism. To what extent should nations or governments maybe encourage nationalism among its citizens? And in 30, we have all of these sources that end up, fitting underneath the umbrella of, to what extent is liberalism an ideology that should be promoted. Now, one thing that we do need to mention is that in order to maybe be a little more precise and a little more judicious and not as vague with the relationships, it's nice that as teachers, when you're teaching these units, that you keep mentioning these recurring themes, so that when the students sit down and write the exam and they're looking at these three sources, they're not at a loss thinking about, what potential themes am I looking for. So it shouldn't be the first time that they're thinking of things like, to what extent is imperialism justifiable, or to what extent is imperialism ethical or beneficial. These are questions that I'd be asking as we explore the topic in 10 of imperialism. So the first step of relationship paragraph is to look at the common theme. Often the common theme can be expressed as an overarching question, a to what extent question that each source is providing an answer for. And we do have this shown in slide 103 in the Prezi that I have indicated to you guys before. So you can go there and boom, we can open that up. And we'll go to slide 103 and we'll see identify and explain one or more to what extent questions. They're possible, but one would be, to what extent can we find a healthy balance in 30 between individualism, freedom, and collectivism control? So that is a key step to get the second part of the assignment, the relationship part of the assignment, started. And often there are multiple themes, as we can see here in slide 105. So another theme that we can see in Social 30, and a theme that can be taught for them, is the idea of the evolution of liberalism. To what extent is liberalism not only justifiable, but to what extent is liberalism in need of further evolution? To what extent is it viable in its present form? Or in some sources, like the three that are at the end of that Prezi, rather than looking at the evolution of liberalism, they look at the devolution of liberalism towards collectivism. It's moving backwards as a paradigm shift back towards the collectivism that maybe dominated more so before the Age of Reason. Now, after we announce the to what extent question, it's only logical that then we will provide some kind of answer. With regards to this question, the voice behind source 1 would say this. And then with regards to this question, the voice behind source 2 would say this. And then with regards to this question, the voice behind source 3 would say this. Now, what that part of the relationship paragraph shouldn't be is a summary of what you've already done in the previous 3 paragraphs when you're interpreting the sources. It should be more focused, more precise, more specific to the to what extent question now that you are showing that all 3 are responding to. A sample of this is also shown in the same Prezi in slide 101. So let's go back to slide 101, take a peek at that. So how would the cartoonist from source 3 respond to, that's showing how they would, after they respond to the source, then we would have them respond to each other. So when we have them responding to each other, then we would have this slide. So you have the overarching theme, you have each of them answer the overarching theme, and then logically you'd have them react to each other. So a type of relationship is a reaction. Have the sources respond to each other. So how would the cartoonist respond to a different cartoonist? How would the voice respond to the photographer? So we're about to see 3 sources here, and within this document, and you have this cartoon, and that's source 3, and you have this cartoon, that is source 2. Typically you wouldn't have 2 cartoons in the same set, but they just fit so nicely together. And then we also had this quote. So how would the voice behind source 1 respond to the cartoonist? How would the people within the cartoon respond to the situation described in source 1? How would the people in the cartoon in source 3 respond to the people in the cartoon in 2? How would the cartoonist from 2 respond to the cartoonist in 3? So there's many levels of this response to each other that we can massage out a little bit. So to begin with, we had the overarching theme. This is a question that holds them together as a set. This is something that all 3 sources are providing an answer to. And then we illustrate what is that answer that the etological perspective of source 1 would provide. What is that answer that the etological perspective of 2 and 3 would provide? And then naturally we have them respond to each other's perspectives. Pointing out things like what kind of bias or limitation or flaw of logic that they might see in the other's responses. And now we could stop there and we might be able to get to an S, but we want to make sure that we unpack as many relationships as possible. So after we establish those holistic relationships that hold them together as a set of 3, now we can unpack what I would call linear ones. Sometimes there may be a rock, a big rock that is in one source that reappears in another source. So maybe one source is talking about anarchy, and whereas one source mentions it, another source illustrates it, or one source is talking about poverty. It mentions poverty, and a different source measures poverty. So we need to see some of those linear lines that connect the sources together. So there might be some vocabulary that is mentioned or illustrated in one that is mentioned and illustrated in another. And again, because we see the same kind of language here, or the same kind of big rocks here, we can see how the sources use the big rocks differently to promote different perspectives. So maybe one source is using the big rock of privacy to suggest that privacy is maybe dangerous, that in society privacy can lead to things that, in privacy people may be plotting against the common good, and therefore privacy needs to be subject to the eyes of government. Whereas another one, also based on privacy, is showing that privacy needs to be the goal of society, that we need to be independent, private of government. So even though they're both about privacy, they're promoting privacy to achieve different ends. So we need to look for common rocks, but also as we look for common rocks, we could say that the privacy mentioned in source 1 as a threat to society is shown in source 2 as the purpose of society. So we're announcing that there's a linear relationship, but we may be contrasting how that rock is being illustrated. We can also look for cause and effect relationships that can sometimes appear to be chronological. Obviously, in Social 20, chronological relationships will be easiest to find because the course is chronological by nature. But there may be some cause and effect chronological relationships in 30 as well. You might have a protest in 30 about civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, and then you might have a chart that shows voting rates. And the outcome of the protests may have an influence on why voting rates have changed. You might have a protest in 30, it shows Black Lives Matter, and you might have some numbers that show the inequality in America. So the inequality shown in source 2 is the reason why we have the protest shown in source 1 with Black Lives Matter. So there can be these cause and effect relationships that one of the sources may be illustrating the cause of why this other thing happens later. If you have a set on, say, the Cold War, you might have a source that is talking about mutual assured destruction, and then another source that talks about détente. Because of mutual assured destruction that's being illustrated in 1, the superpowers were forced to embrace détente, shown in 2, because they didn't want to go to war because war became suicide. Could the perspective from one source be used to further or perhaps refute the perspective of another? Is there evidence in one source that maybe another source was based upon a miscalculation or a misassumption? So that's another relationship, a linear one, that source 3 is providing evidence or argumentation that could be used to combat the position being furthered in source 2 or source 1. Another perspective that can be shown here is, do they have similar context? Maybe they're both responding to the OPEC crisis, or they're both talking about the FLQ crisis, or they're both talking about the war in Vietnam. Is there the same audience? But contrast, what kind of response are they trying to elicit from that audience? Are they using similar literary tools like tone and irony? So lots of steps we can use. Now I'd like to look at some samples. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that not only in that Prezi is there some samples, but in that video that I shared out before from the document on how to do an A1, there's already a 12-minute YouTube video on A1 relationships for students. So it goes through 3 sources from Social 30, and it breaks them down. So we're not going to repeat that set, but we're going to do some other sets together. So let's go to our collection of sets. We're going to skip the first set because that's the one that is done in that other video that's on YouTube for 12 minutes. But let's go to the next step and see if we can see, or the next set, sorry, see if we can see some relationships. So here's the first source. Fortunately, Canadians have the right to think and speak freely and to associate with whomever they choose. These rights, as well as others, are entrenched in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Thankfully, with the Charter in place, citizens are protected from arbitrary actions that could be taken by the state. I'm going to use that source, by the way, in Social 9 when I talk about the Charter. I'm going to use that source, by the way, in Social 10 when I talk about human rights. I'm going to refer to that source in 20 when I talk about human rights, so that by the time we get to 30, they're very comfortable with the language and the presentation of sources. Then the second source is from the USSR, and there's a pretty big attachment there that gives us context about it being from a show trial in the 1930s. And then we have that cartoon. That cartoon, by the way, in one form or another was used on both the 31 and the 32 diploma exams. And it's a brilliant cartoon to really look at that Orwellian-esque, because the eyes in the sky there, surveillance world that we live in post 9/11, and with COVID-19 and with COVID tracking and things like that with our phones, this whole topic has taken like a new importance in our society. So anyways, we have these 3 sources first step would be to break them down individually, talk about their context, their big rocks, how it connects to the themes of the course, talk about the problem that it's presenting, the ideological perspective that it's the solution, the assumptions, the values associated with that solution, everything that we did in the previous lesson. But once we've done that for all three, and while we're doing it for all three, we should be thinking about what are some possible relationships. So, keeping in mind that this is me working cold here. I have nothing prepared on these three, but let's look at them and see if we have some common relationships. So we want to look at for a to what extent relationship. So this source is really promoting the perspective that people must be controlled. This one is looking at people that are controlled, and this one is promoting freedom. So, to what extent is it desirable for government to control the actions of its citizens? Fortunately, Canadians have the right to think and speak freely, so this one's saying no. Governments don't need to control the people, although in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in the preamble, it says we can be reasonably limited, right? But it can't be arbitrary actions taken by the state. So, with regards to the overarching theme, to what extent is it desirable for the government to control the actions of its citizens? This one would say those controls cannot be arbitrary. They must be reasonable and justified, as it says in the Charter. So that's an overarching theme that this source is definitely answering. To what extent is it desirable for the government to control the actions of its citizens? Is this one answering that question? Our whole country, from young to old, is awaiting and demanding one thing: the traitors and spies who are selling our country to the enemy must be shot like dirty dogs. Our people are demanding one thing: crush the accursed reptile. Time will pass, the graves of the hateful traitors will grow over with weeds and thistle, but over us, over our happy country, our sun will shine with its luminous rays. To what extent do we need to be controlled? Or to what extent can we be free to question the state? So here, underneath the umbrella, to what extent should the government control the actions of its citizens, the source would be suggesting that the actions of some citizens must be controlled because they are traitors. Because they are hateful traitors. The actions of hateful traitors must be controlled. That not only should their actions be controlled, they need to be eliminated. They need to be put into graves. They must be shot like dirty dogs because they're selling out our country. So, to what extent should we practice collectivism over individualism? This one is suggesting that the goods of the nation must come before the goods of the individuals. This one is suggesting that unless it's something that can be reasonably justified, individualism must be promoted over collectivism. So that's another overarching theme. So to what extent should the government control the actions of its citizens? To what extent should collectivism be promoted over individualism? So we have more than one overarching theme here. And within this source, entering video surveillance area, you have citizens walking. Our eyes secure your safety. The perspective being promoted by the government is that the closed caption television is providing security, that in surveillance there is security, but the overall message of the source could be attached to, are there too many cameras? And these eyes in the sky really are key to the ideological perspective. If you look at the eyes in the sky and you see something malicious, something violating, then the government's actions are not justifiable. But if these eyes seem to reflect that the government is creating safety, that we don't see any violence, we don't see any lack of security here, then perhaps this is actually celebrating the government, saying, yay, we're safe now. But a lot of people, when this was on the exam, they saw that the government was being Orwellian, and that the people were, maybe because of the cameras, they were safe from each other, but now they were no longer safe from government because the government was invading their Fourth Amendment their right to privacy. So once you have the to what extent question and you have answered it from each perspective, then you have them, respond to each other's answers. So this is a key word, right? Arbitrary actions. Is what's happening here, is it arbitrary? So, or, this one's celebrating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Is what's happening here only possible because they don't have a constitution that the government must reside under? That here you have Stalin that's above the law, and that's why he's able to do that. Here you have constitutional law. So you have rule of law and you have law and order being played out between these two sources. So that's how they respond to that theme differently, but it's also beginning to massage out that linear relationship. So linear relationship might be that arbitrary actions and citizens are protected. And are we being protected here? No, it seems like we are being destroyed by government. And where is the protection? Here you have the state saying we're protecting you by the cameras, but others might be saying no, the cameras are what's actually the threat to us. Let's move on to another set. So here we have a set where you have a cartoon about democracy, you have another source about democracy, and then you have a chart about voting turnout. So then you're looking for an overarching theme. So this one's critical of democracy because it's suggesting that people are apathetic. This one is critical of democracy because it's saying that people are not capable of finding a true leadership. And this one is showing apathy. So to what extent is democracy flawed? Is an umbrella big enough to fit everything that we see underneath it? Source 3 would say democracy is flawed because we're seeing apathy in elections. That at times less than half of the people, or close to half of the people, are voting in America. So one of the flaws of democracy is apathy. The second source is suggesting that democracy is flawed because the people that vote will be revulsed by outstanding genius. That democracy is flawed because it will not produce enough real statesmen at the same time to provide the bodies needed in an elected assembly. So this one's showing the flaws of democracy, the flaws of elections. This one's showing a flaw of election being apathy. So to what extent are democratic elections flawed? Would be something that's maybe more precise, right? Democratic elections are flawed because of apathy, because of lack of ability, and again because of apathy. The problem shown in source 1 is being illustrated with the trend in 3. But the voice behind 2 would say that the masses not wanting to vote or not voting is not really a problem. It would be better if they didn't vote at all. So that's how they respond to each other. That perhaps source 1 and 3 would like to grow more democracy, would like to inspire these people to vote more, whereas source 2 would say, no, we don't want them to vote more, we want them to vote less, because they're voting without the ability. Here's another set. We have a protest. We can never rest. We must so inform all the world, including the Kremlin, that until the enslaved nations of the world have, in the fullness of freedom, the right to choose their own path, that then and only then can we say that there's a possible way of living peacefully and permanently with communism in the world. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 52. And then we have this cartoon about Iraq. So we got Iraq, 2003. We've got Eisenhower, 52. And we have the United States, 67. So obviously not the same context, right? Here you have the United States imposing liberalism in Vietnam, fighting a civil war in Vietnam, stopping dominoes. Here you have a generation or a decade earlier, some of the foundation of that foreign policy being created. And here you have a post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy. So there is a foreign policy element holding them together from the U.S. perspective. So interestingly enough, here you have the idea that the United States is not allowing dissent. You cannot question the practice of warfare. Here you have a president that is saying that every country of the world should have self-determination. And here you have a U.S. government that is maybe not allowing self-determination for the North Vietnamese. So in terms of getting some to what extent questions, to what extent can the U.S. foreign policy be used to promote liberalism? And if so, how is the best way, right? That we can't really promote liberalism abroad by violating the free choice of individuals like the Vietnamese. There's lots of great linear relationships here, isn't there? That we can never rest until the enslaved nations of the world have in the fullness of freedom the right to choose their own path. That language in 2 would make me want to link it to 3 or to 1 here and say, was the United States violating the choice of the Viet Cong people to choose the type of government they have? These people are saying, stop bombing. We don't want to be in Vietnam because it's not really a war about dominoes, and the United States is in Vietnam committing war crimes, burning villages and targeting, and unfortunately, as collateral damage, children are being targeted. This source 3 is providing the other 2 fit in so nicely. The source 3 is a little bit more difficult. Dissent is unpatriotic. Slaps that guy. So one of the questions could be that in their combat against non-liberalism, so this is we can't allow non-liberalism to exist. So to what extent during the United States combating a non-liberalism, as shown in source 2, did the United States become illiberal as it's being mentioned in 1 and 3? To what extent combating non-liberalism, combating aggressive nations, did the United States become the image of the enemy that they're trying to defeat? That's the overarching theme here, right? So sometimes it takes a minute. Look at them as a set. Here you have a source on, sorry it's sideways there, but you have a source on the FLQ, and then you have a couple of sources. We've already broken down this one in great detail, and you have another source talking about the Canadian Charter. So we do have some reoccurring themes that they keep using the same types of sources. And I think that one thing that you can do in grade 10 and grade 11 is, before you begin teaching the course, identify what are those big themes that I want to address, and then build some sources around those themes, and then introduce those sources through your class, and then either test those sources or test similar sources on your exams, so that on the exams the students aren't blown away by something that's completely alien to anything that they've ever seen. If you show them a source and there's no nuances within the source that are familiar, then is the source fair? So again, I would think that in the planning stage here, how do you plan for your students to do better on the relationship paragraph? You need to identify what relationships am I wanting them to be able to identify at the end of the course. And those are the relationships you need to teach during the course. And as you teach them, you have sets of sources in mind. And as you test them, you may test them on the same sources, but if you're worried about them just regurgitating what you've already said about those sources, then you find similar sources and you test them on that. So, relationships is the biggest part of the A1 activity marks-wise. It's a paragraph out of 6. The other paragraphs are 4 marks each. And it is the part of the assignment that some students end up underperforming on because they forget to do that first step. So going back to the beginning here, the first step is the overarching theme. What holds the 3 sources together as a set? Identify an overarching theme. Often it's expressed as a to what extent question. After you have identified that theme, the next logical step is to say, with regards to this question, source 1 would answer it like this, then 2 and 3. Then have them react to each other's answers. Have them respond to the assumptions and values and biases that the others are promoting. After you do that, then get into some linear relationships. Linear ones are those ones where you're like the exposing of poverty in source 1 is shown in the data in source 3, or the issue of scapegoatism that is being shown in 1 is being highlighted with the propaganda poster in 3 that is promoting scapegoatism. So in the second way of relating them, we look for those common rocks that they're each exploring, those linear relationships. And also, sometimes we can find some cause and effect. So maybe source 1 shows Pearl Harbor and source 3 shows the atomic bombing of Japan in 1945. There's a relationship there. There's a chronological cause and effect relationship that students should be able to identify. So we have holistic relationships, we have linear relationships, we have cause and effect relationships, we have relationships around common language. And I think if students can express enough of these relationships, the marker would have to sit back and say, wow, that's very comprehensive. They're very precise. And those are the descriptors of an E that we're trying to get our students to get to. All right. So there is a video on YouTube called Social 30-1, A1 Relationships, that is 12 minutes long, that goes into more detail about 3 specific sources that you can go to for the next step here.